Welcome, everyone, to the L7C podcast. Today, we have a very serious episode for you all today with the recent events that have happened at the Supreme Court. We're going to be talking about Roe v. Wade being overturned, our reactions, our responses, go over how this came to be and what this means going for the future. So first off, we have our, I guess you could say, like, mental health expert now, leader of this one, Dr. Kassie Lowery. How are you doing today, ma'am?
I am doing just peachy, but slightly less peachy than before.
That is sad and understandable. We have our pop culture expert, Miss Chelsea Heppert. How are you doing today, ma'am?
Overall good, but overall not good too at the same time. So we're here.
That's sad.
Yeah.
We have our My Hero enthusiast, Andrea Alaniz. How are you doing today?
I'm kind of echoing Kassie and Chelsea's sentiments of like, I'm here, we're existing, pushing through, but is it really all that great since everything happened? Not so much. So glad we're doing this podcast. I'll say that.
Yeah.
And then we have two new people on the L7C podcast, courtesy of Dr. Kassie Lowery. We have Danielle Hernandez. First of all, Danielle, are you a doctor or no? Because I want to make sure I give you the respect you deserve.
Oh, thank you. I am.
All right. So Dr. Danielle Hernandez, how are you doing today, ma'am?
Same as everybody else, it seems.
And then Keshav, are you a doctor or no?
I am not.
Okay, so we have Mr. Keshav. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing just about the same as everybody else.
It's Keshav.
Keshav. Keshav. Mr. Keshav. Thank you. But we'll start with Keshav then, since you and Danielle are first time on here. What do you do? How did you come to the podcast? And what do you like to do? Like a little introduction thing.
Yeah, so I work with Dr. Kassie Lowery. There I am a psychometrist, so I do a lot of the psychological assessments, testing for ADHD, autism, dementia, and everything in between. So I just kind of help out wherever is needed.
And Dr. Hernandez, what do you like to do? What do you do?
Those are two different things. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah.
There's definitely some good crossover. So I'm working as an LP psychologist in New York City, but I am also an artist, and I specialize, jumping back to the psychology, in working with LGBTQ youth.
Are you currently in New York right now?
I sure am.
Man, I wish I knew you were in New York. I was trying to do a good job in reading everyone's state stuff.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, I read Ohio's, Indiana's, Texas, but I didn't know you were from New York, so I apologize.
No worries, no worries. I mean, we're mostly the privileged folks, if you can say that, as privileged as you can get these days.
That's a good thing, as privileged as you can get these days. But let's get right into it. Whole bunch of questions we're going to be going over. And we'll just go right into it. I'll ask some questions. Typically, all the questions are going to start with Kassie, and then Kassie will ask everyone else what their thoughts are. So I'll just be in the background, popping in every now and again with a couple of different questions, oppositions, questions to people's opinions. So if I sound like I'm taking one side, I am not. I'm just throwing the other side's questions out there. So Kassie, are you ready? All right. So very, first little baby pitch. What is Roe v. Wade?
So Roe v. Wade is obviously a very talked about issue at the moment, given everything that happened with the Supreme Court. And I think people have been kind of holding their breath since about May at this point, I think, is when the leak first came out. I think part of us probably hoped that we would not see this day come, and part of us knew that it was likely to occur given the makeup of the Supreme Court. But really, it was the law that was put in place a long time ago, not really long, ago, 49 years ago, that was meant to ensure the bodily autonomy of women when it comes to abortions, because obviously our reproductive systems work much different than males. But the other thing that I think a lot of people are kind of missing is that there's a lot of stuff that also falls under that. Right now, we're all talking about the abortion portion. But there is also a large threat coming with this overthrow, or I guess overturn, of Roe v. Wade, because there are other precedents that were kind of protected under that in terms of same-sex marriage, contraception, things like that. And there's been a lot in the news recently about, obviously, there have been some comments about going after those things next. So I think we think about Roe versus Wade as being like this abortion law, and it's not necessarily just that. And it's going to affect a lot of people that don't necessarily think that it has any ruling on their lives. And I think that's one of the biggest things, and partially the reason that I thought it was important to have this conversation. Because originally, Martin and I had discussed having a conversation about having women navigate mental health services. And then the ruling came out, and kind of needed to take a step back and talk about some physical stuff as well. Hopefully we'll eventually get to the mental health stuff. But right now, this is kind of the big piece that I think everybody's grappling with and trying to find a space and community with.
Does anyone else want to add anything in regards to what Roe v. Wade is?
I say, if anybody knows any more about the law, I would be happy to. I mean, obviously, I've found out a lot about the law just within the last couple of weeks because it's become an area of focus. But if anybody else knows, I'm certainly not a lawyer, and I'm not well versed in law itself.
I guess the most basic thing of it is that it gave women the protection and the liberty to choose to have an abortion. That was the main biggest thing. So that means no state or city, county, whatever, could just outlaw abortion. So that was like the main crux of it. And obviously the abortion debate, pro-life, pro-choice, has become, it's a political debate now. It's definitely used for political aspirations. If you take one side, you think you're going to get these votes. If you take another side, you think you're going to get these votes. So then the way it got overturned was the Dobbs versus Jackson's Women's Health Organization. That was in 2002, where fast forward now, the Supreme Court said because of that case, there is nowhere in the Constitution, which was written, again, a very, very long time ago, that abortion is protected in the Constitution. Hence, we overturn stuff. But I do want to throw just a general question to everyone. So when you fast forward, it was May 2nd, 2022, where on Twitter, it was leaked that the Supreme Court was going to change it. So a month before it actually happened. What did everyone think when you first saw that leak?
I know for me, I wasn't necessarily surprised just because of all of former President Trump's groundwork that he did with changing the Supreme Court. I was not surprised. I was just disappointed. And then I actually had an upcoming OBGYN appointment. So I opened that door with my gynecologist about tubal ligation and making my choice of permanently never being able to have kids, because it's never been something that I've wanted. And I know I've touched about this in other podcasts too, but just going that route rather than continuing with my IUD. And fortunately, my doctor, he is very, very pro patient and whatever the patient wants and needs. And as someone who advocated just, this is a one-time conversation. I don't need anything else from you. I just needed to hear those words. And you tell me when you want to do this. And he made it a very clear point that no matter what came about with the decision, that he would do everything in his power to protect me as a patient first. So that was one of the first steps that I did after hearing or reading the Twitter report and reading the actual draft.
Floor is open.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to say that I was shocked because I come from a very red state. I'm from Texas. I was living in Ohio up until about 8 months ago.
Mm-hmm.
So, and Ohio was the one passing the heartbeat bill. I think they were the first ones to do that, or one of the first ones. So I wasn't surprised. I was just, as a criminal justice student, I had a hard time wrapping my head around how they would actually overturn it, since Roe v. Wade has set precedent. For several years, the ruling came out in, I believe it was January of 1972. And a lot of Roe v. Wade is predicated on a right to privacy. So as much as we talk about the abortion portion of it and that impact, people seem to forget the underlying protection Roe v. Wade provide to all Americans to enhancing their right to privacy. So I was upset. I actually had a naive hope that with all of the backlash that came out from the leak, the ship would self-correct, that they would kind of, maybe change their decision, reverse their thinking, or dig a little deeper. I don't know. I did have the naive hope that it wouldn't actually happen.
Anyone else thoughts on when you saw the leak coming out?
I was kind of in the same boat as you, Andrea, where, I had a feeling that it was coming and eye on the pulse or, finger on the pulse type of a thing. And then I was actually in testing with a client, and I got a text message from Cassie saying that it had been overturned. And, thankfully I was basically at the end of the day with that client. So I got to deal with, my own emotions with all of that. But I know one of the other kind of therapists in our practice just kept having, session after session. And I know it was very challenging for her. So it's just a very hard thing to face as, just a person in society looking at what is being taken away from people and what is almost up next and what this can lead to.
Kassie, Danielle, anything you want to add?
Yeah, when I first heard, the news of the leak, I think I wasn't surprised given the barrage of law stripping and right stripping that's been going on. It sort of didn't feel, like a tipping point to me. I felt like the tipping point had already come. Again, I mentioned, my focus is on LGBTQ youth, and this comes after trans rights had been stripped on and on and on. So I sort of felt it as just another layer of that cake that was already in front of me, which is not a great place to be in. At the same time, I will say that my thoughts were less about the immediate ramifications. And I think my mind took a tumble fall, as I think a lot of our minds did, into, Plessy v. Ferguson's going to get overturned. We're going to have segregation again. Don't even ask about marriage equality. That's out. Like, it's only inevitable. But as I mentioned before, I was also sitting in as privileged a place as I could be in New York, where, I heard these reassurances in my community all around me saying, well, not us, but I was the odd one out. And I was like, I'm an honorary Hoosier. My folks in Indiana, thinking about them.
Yeah.
Folks in Ohio too. Obviously so much of the country.
So I'll be honest, I don't know that I was active enough on Twitter to know at that point, like, what was going on. Like, I learned about the Twitter leak, like, probably a little bit closer to when the actual overturn happened. I will say that there's people have brought up a lot of like points, and I've been listening to a lot of different podcasts. I mean, the reality is that I've cried twice in response to anything like truly political. Once was happy tears about 7 years ago when I found out that I had friends that were going to be able to get married and have the same rights, at least in marriage, as I was going to have. That my brother was going to be able to get married, that was going to be seen as being just basic human right. And then I was standing outside when I got the news about the actual overturn. And I think naively, I hoped that something bad was not going to, or at least something as bad as what happened was not going to happen. And I remember standing there and I looked at my phone and like just seemed like it was a kind of another day. And then I walked inside and I looked at the television. And I started crying because I realized that like some of my rights had been stripped. And there's a double-edged sword that comes along with that, because I think the other piece is that I sit in a very privileged point. And I've done a lot of reflection on that in the past couple of weeks that makes it hard to even really focus on just this. Because the reality is I have a lot of privileges that other people are not afforded. Especially as being like a doctoral, like white woman. I'm always working to learn more, but I think this is one of those things that there's a lot of people out there that are like, yeah, this sucks, but like this is reality for a lot of us, and it has been our entire lives. And I think that's a part that needs to be more part of this conversation. But I also, as I mentioned before, I think people don't realize exactly how much this is going to impact everybody and not just women. Because I mean, let's be honest, like women may be the ones getting the abortions, but the reality is there's a man on the other side of that baby or fetus,
and it might be the men. Ooh,
yeah,
it might be the men getting the abortions too. We don't want to forget about our trans men, non-binary folks, anybody who has that uterus vagina combo. Yeah.
And I mean, Danielle's right. Like that's even like a part that we need to like reword. Like we're all talking about women, but the reality is like it's not just women. Like there is a whole, like there's non-binary folk, there are trans men, there are like there's just a huge amount that we're not taking into account. And I think that's just so important to remember at this point. And I continue to learn every day, as we just talked about.
Fair enough. You fast forward a month, the 24th of June, which was a couple weeks ago. It comes out that it was overturned. I mean, I remember where I was at when I got the news. So Chelsea, when you first got the news, what did you think?
I was just heartbroken, not just for myself, but for everyone around me. I was at work at that point and I couldn't even process my feelings because I had a lot of stuff going on. So I couldn't even allow myself just to feel, because if I felt something, I would have broken down. And then that Saturday night, like I sat in my bed, and it's been a while since I've cried, but I just sobbed. And I still am having a hard time just processing it all. Like it's mind blowing, because it's not just about women, as we touched on, but it's also about everyone as a whole. And then there's also so many other cases that have the potential of being overturned and setting us back as a nation and stripping away so many more rights that people don't even have, that had some semblance of protection, but now it's all gone, type of a deal. So yeah.
On a lighter note, I was in the bathroom when it happened. So just throwing some little humor in this somber one. But no, seriously, I was in the bathroom, and then like I yell like, holy shit. And then Courtney thinks that like I tripped in the bathroom, like I was an old man. And I was telling her how I got overturned, and I just sat in the bathroom for a little bit, just sitting there like, man, this is not going to be well. And for me personally, I think the timing, well, I don't think it should have happened at all, but I think the timing was horrendous because the day before the Supreme Court ruled that the Second Amendment is right up there with freedom of speech and religion. So like the day before you said guns, like right to bear arms, right up there. But then the right to an abortion, we'll pass you to the side. So I do think that timing it added a little bad icing on the cake. Kassie, where were you at when you found out?
I was standing outside with Walter. And I think that's Walter's my dog. Yeah, he's my 7-month-old like case golden retriever. But like I said, I was standing outside and really your little news things pop up on your phone, and like I saw it and I was like, no, that's right. And I think I walked in after a couple minutes, and my lovely father, who is a little Democratic blue dot in the state that we live in, had the news on. And I sat there and I listened for a second, and I was actually supposed to be leaving to go to Tennessee, and I just cried. And if anybody knows me, I don't cry. Not really something I do. I joke that I don't like feelings, which is hilarious for a mental health professional.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like it mixes well. Ooh, echo. I was going to say, it doesn't sound like it mixes well for someone who works mental health and doesn't like
Yeah,
feelings.
I mean, I had a privilege in the fact that I literally was on my way to go on vacation and decompress, and I was supposed to be getting away from stress. And I think about 15 minutes after I saw the leak, I got to drive through Kentucky, where my rights had already been technically stripped because they had a trigger law in place. And then I got to kind of sit with the fact that was going to be the new reality, is when I cross state lines, I'm going to have different rights. They're not going to just be they're not going to be the same. And yeah, I think it was an interesting moment, and I have continued to intermittently find myself in tears randomly as I have gone through different weeks and found more and more out. And I was in a privileged position where I was at, because I texted Keshav and I said, hey, it happened. And honestly, I was so distraught at the time that I didn't think about where anybody else was, which is not super great. But I think it was just one of those instances where this is going to be that 9/11 moment. You're going to look back and you're going to know exactly where you were no matter what happened. I know exactly where I was on 9/11. I sat in my 5th grade classroom and we watched the second plane hit. I am 30 years old, and it's been 21 years, and I can still see it. And that is I have a feeling it's going to be how this is for a lot of people for a really long time.
Yeah, and mega echo. And I do want to say that for when you brought up the different states things, for the people listening to this who are what does that mean? So with it being overturned, basically the Supreme Court said it's up to your state, abortion laws and all that are up to a state level, and they're not protected by the US Constitution. So if you're in California and abortion there, that's legal, you can do it there. But if you go somewhere like you said, Tennessee, you can't have an abortion there. So now it's based on your state's officials and what bills come into place. But before we keep moving, everyone else, where were you guys at? How did you guys feel?
I was interestingly enough, it was mid-work day break to plan Pride weekend things. I had just texted one of my partners to say, I'll buy some champagne for the morning. And then I saw the news and I was like, well, shit, I better make it really clear when I go into this small local liquor store. I'll be like, guys, buying the champagne, but it's not to celebrate. Because even though I'm in New York City, I'm in the most conservative spot of New York City. Nobody really realizes that New York City has a conservative area. And I could go on a little rant about the gerrymandering happening right now, but it's about to get worse. That's for a whole other situation. But yeah, I was just like, I can't buy this champagne. So I did dress all in black, though, to make a statement.
I was in the middle of a training, an equality training, actually, at that. I was very glad it was virtual because I didn't have to have my camera on, and I don't check my phones during trainings. I'm very much like, I love learning. I love trainings, especially equality trainings. I now, if you've heard different podcasts I've been in, my background is working with within children's services. So a lot of low income families. I now work for a public housing agency, and the particular location I'm at is the lowest of the low, just above homelessness. So very important training. And then Martin, either you alerted me or I got a different alert on my phone, so I already know, but the timing is very close. It all hit me, but I couldn't let it. It was like sporadic through the whole day. There was some other stuff going on that we were talking about, and I was on the verge of tears several times during the training. I couldn't fully focus during the training, which really upset me because, like, when giving presentations, I hope my audience is engaged. So being on the opposite end, I want to be engaged for presenters and like absorb all that information. So I felt guilty for not being fully present and mindful of every single thing they were throwing at us, because it was a really informational and good training. And then I made the mistake of sharing this with one of my coworkers, the news, and he was completely oblivious. Like, what does that mean? And then he tried to make it better by saying like, oh, well, it's not illegal. Like, you won't get arrested. And I'm just like, so that added fuel to my internal fire. I'm looking at the messages between Martin and I right now, and at 11:15 a.m., my statement was, I want to fight, I want to cry, I also just want to crawl in a hole and never come out. Like, I felt stripped. I felt completely vulnerable. I made a personal choice to stop my birth control a few months back to see kind of what would happen, because I was on it for a medical reason for a very long time. And so, again, I do live in Texas. There was already kind of that, if I was ever assaulted, my right to an abortion already was limited. Living in San Antonio, there was more accessibility, but where I grew up, our closest abortion clinic was 4 hours away. So accessibility had already been in my consciousness as a teenager, as a young adult, when I would come back home for the summers during college. But it was just a whole new sensation. And I was angry. I don't typically use Twitter. I went off on Twitter. I was livid. I was angry. And again, Texas, big gun rights state. So with the decision, like Martin said right before, where it's like, oh no, we can't trust states to make decisions about, people's legal abilities to obtain guns. But, women's, reproductive rights, childbearing persons, reproductive rights, like, seriously? So it was maddening. I think, Martin, it was either that evening or the next day, we were on the phone about it for a very long time. I talked to my mom, who is a medical professional. She's a nurse practitioner, and she was at a low. She was visibly sad. She didn't cry, at least during our phone conversation, but we went off about it for several hours. And I feel like anytime this topic comes up, I could go on a rant forever. But it's still just, it's like, at least for me right now in this moment, the last week, I try to forget, but at the same time, you can't. Like, that's just not, we can't forget about it. We can't just let it be what it is. But at the same time, I personally have a feeling of what can be done, what should we do next, to get these rights and protections back. And I don't have those answers, or I don't fully understand the steps that would need to be taken. So I'm also at this moment looking for a little bit of direction.
It was that Friday night because Saturday was the other Chelsea's of the L7C's podcast wedding. So it was that Friday because I remember
That's right.
because I was drinking Kool-Aid Jammers, just throwing in there for some laughs. But Keshav, ooh, did I get it right?
Yeah, you got it. You got it.
Look at that. I'm back. But what did you think?
Like I was saying, I was in testing, and for everybody who hasn't been kind of part of testing or doesn't know much about it, it's basically like you're in a room isolated with just one other person. So like all of your attention, at least from the assessor side, is like completely on them. You're trying to do everything right. You're trying to just kind of be in the moment and make sure that you're documenting everything for, you know, the doctor and for later points in time to kind of look over all of the data. And so, you know, normally I'm a very much a like, you know, I have an open minute. I'm going to scroll on Twitter, see if the world has ended, or, you know, maybe a happy, you know, dog photo or something like that. Try to get some levity in life occasionally. But, you know, during those like, you know, 3, 4, 5, 6 hours, it's kind of just like complete isolation, just so that, you know, you can give the client the proper attention that they deserve. And like I said, I got the text from Cassie, and it's just like all of the blood just rushed out of my body, you know, because it's just, this is supposed to be the land of the free, and now it just seems oxymoronic. Like, just, you know, how can a gun have more rights than a person? How can an unborn person have more rights than the person who they are being, you know, bared by? To me, it is very, I don't know, it's just disheartening to kind of watch the whole situation go on. And again, I'm a very much as like spiraler. So like, what happens next? What is the next right that's going to be taken away? Is it going to be Brown versus Board of Education? It's, you know, it's most likely going to be something like same-sex marriage and all the things associated with that. And it makes me feel like India is much more of a better place to go and live, even though a lot of the rights that we have there are much, you know, don't exist as much as they do here. But the way that we're going, you know, a lot of other places are going to have more rights. You know, you can get better healthcare in India and Canada. You can get, you know, things like that. And even here, you know, my wife has to pay like $1,200 for her healthcare between all the different things that she has. And, you know, it's not covering anything, you know.
So this question, which isn't on the little questionnaire thing, but a similar thing. And this one more goes to, I know we've talked about like, it's not just about the women in this situation, but I do want to ask for the ladies on the pod, how did it feel then going like on Twitter or Instagram, Facebook, so whatever thing you look at, and then you see like other women celebrating this? How did that make you feel?
I particularly like to use TikTok. It's one, an escape half of the time, but two, you get a lot of really great information out of it. But in that feed, fortunately, I was able to see a lot of people who were upset with the decision. However, when I jumped to Facebook, for example, that's where I saw more people celebrating, if you will, the fact that it was overturned. And it was disheartening. And I was also disgusted to look at. And then it just brought me back to 2016 when we were voting and people having the insane thought to say that you were overreacting when you would voice like your concerns of, hey, these rights could get stripped away, or hey, racism is very much like a thing and no one's concerned about all of these remarks that a presidential candidate has said. And then fast forward through 2020 to now, it's disheartening to see that these people are still living in the fact that they can celebrate this and that they're okay with what is happening with our country, but everyone else is just falling apart around them.
Anyone else like to add on to that?
I have so many reactions to that question.
Go ahead. You're running the show, man. Say what you want to say.
Well, and in all honesty, there have been so many, like Andrea, I could go on a rant for like hours. I do to other people. I have surrounded myself with a lot of people that think the way that I think, which limits the amount of celebration that I saw. And I think that is one of those things that I've pointed out repeatedly to people. Like, if you've never seen The Social Dilemma on Netflix, like, you really need to watch it. Because quite frankly, it's terrifying how much a lot of our views come from the fact that we are categorized into we're categorized into a lot of different categories, but when it comes to Democratic versus Republican, very targeted. And it's scary how much it's targeted. That being said, I, like Chelsea, found a lot of solace in TikTok. I think TikTok is a great place and also can be a problematic place. But again, it tailors itself to what I already know. Doing a little bit more digging into Facebook, as Facebook always does, is I found people who I was either really disappointed to not see comment at all. And that's everybody's right. I don't think that's a problem, but I know that there are certain people who are very, very vocal on social media that either didn't say anything or made kind of like a vague, non-committal kind of like commentary. And as somebody who I've never understood why what other people do should concern other people. What happens in my body is not something that somebody else needs to like be worried about outside of themselves. I don't understand at what point did we take this let's be real. We were all taught in elementary school, middle school, and high school that we had a separation of church and state. That is not true. And I don't think that that's something that took a sudden left-hand turn. It has gradually kept turning, and it just is getting more and more prevalent. But to see a country that was founded theoretically on religious freedom, use a lot of religion to back up not letting other people have abortions. That's what just boggles my mind. Like, pro-choice, pro-life, I don't understand why we can't just understand that I'm not going to make you get an abortion, but you shouldn't make me have a baby. Especially, like, a lot of people talk about how it's discrediting to only say, like, well, what about people that get incest or like rape? And there was definitely a point in time, because as we grow, we learn more and more that probably would have been one of the comments that I made. But at this point, like, we're not set up in a country where anybody takes care of the kid after they're born. So, and the other thing, like, it's the mental gymnastics of constantly being like, oh, well, like, what about the kid after they're born? Like, what if the parents can't take care of them? Well, there's welfare, but then you're going to get looked at like you're a horrible person if you walk into a grocery store and you happen to be on food stamps. What if you didn't know you were pregnant for the first couple months, and let's say that you're like 20 and it's normal to like 21, like go out and drink or smoke or do whatever, like things that you would never have planned if you were planning on having a child. And now not only are you required to have a child that is not going to be their healthiest self, but you've also just condemned that child to a lifetime of potentially having a lot of struggles that shouldn't happen. It's one of those things. And I mean, again, I can go on like a spiral, obviously, but it just doesn't make sense to me. Like why should I care who you're marrying? Like, pay your taxes, do the stuff you're supposed to do, be a good person, don't kill people. Like, these seem pretty like baseline. Like, let people marry who they want to marry. Let loving couples who are same sex adopt babies that are in this foster care system that you're already complaining about paying for. Like, just let people have families. Let them live their lives. So I'm gonna let Danielle jump in on this because I saw that she's moving like she has something to say.
My brain was taking all sorts of directions as you were talking. One of them was about adoption, but that's a whole. If you decide to do an adoption podcast, get me on that. But I'll reduce my drive to talk about that, and instead I'll kind of circle back to the original question. Just, what was it like seeing, especially like women celebrating? And I can say there was plenty of that in my neck of the woods, oddly enough. But right, again, I think different parts of me and different identities that I hold were all seeming to react in different ways to other people's happiness. I think the queer woman side of me who has an extremely low risk of pregnancy was mostly just frustrated of, you have no idea what your single issue voting, not that we vote in the Supreme Court, but we vote in the people who appoint folks to the Supreme Court. You have no idea what the ramifications are of that because you're so tunnel vision focused on abortion, right? So but again, low risk of pregnancy for myself. So I think I was able to feel maybe less grief than some of my, at least one of my partners in particular, felt a lot of grief around it. And, just a lot of tears around seeing the celebration. But another feeling, which classic psychologist, right? Anger is a feeling that I've been, growing into and working on allowing myself to feel. And the anger really came up, I think, because I started thinking also just as a Puerto Rican woman about the history of Puerto Ricans and how this is very similar to the forced pregnancy and the forced sterilization that was happening in Puerto Rico, which, if you all want, La Operación is a really good documentary if you want to learn a little bit more about that, anybody listening who's a documentary fan. But so there was just this anger about that because it's sort of like, for Puerto Ricans, it's sort of not the first hit, it's not even the second hit. It's probably, one of many hits. And so that was just kind of just pure lividness. So there we go. I had anger, frustration. And then I was also kind of just trying to hold the sadness and grief of a partner. And that's where I was at.
My algorithms for TikTok, not TikTok, Instagram, because I don't have a TikTok. I see all of the reels from TikTok on Instagram, on the Instagram reels. Basically, when the news came out, I only switched between Instagram and Twitter. And so my algorithm, I think, insulated me from seeing any sort of celebration, which I was very thankful for because I don't know how I would have handled that. The first time I saw somebody that I knew personally, celebrating, throwing out the religious quotes and different things like that was several days later. And it's somebody that I no longer speak to on a regular basis. So I was able to just kind of solidify, like, yeah, this is a person I no longer need to speak to or engage with. I was slightly worried. Growing up, my parents didn't particularly talk about politics, so I was also slightly nervous talking to my mom about everything because I wasn't sure exactly how she was going to shake out on it. And the same can be said about my dad. And so I was going home the following weekend, and I wasn't sure exactly what I was going to walk into, in the sense of if he would bring it up, if he would make kind of an off comment just to get a rise out of me because he finds that to be funny, which is a whole nother conversation in itself. But luckily he didn't make any comments about it. So I have been privileged to be insulated from all of that. I know there are plenty of people around me, but I don't necessarily have them on social media, being in Texas, that were celebrating, that were happy about the decision. I'm just so far lucky to not know them personally. But anything, the day of Twitter sphere, the next day afterwards, upset. I think there was a specific tweet that came out from the San Antonio News Twitter account talking about how, I think it was a bishop, a Texas bishop, made a comment about how they were pleased at, the decision of the Supreme Court to protect life, blah, 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 blah. And I responded to that in kind about, I'm sure they would also be pleased to no longer have to be arrested and charged for molesting and or sexually assaulting young children. So I took it there because the level of anger I feel at people celebrating, and kind of, it's also almost a jealousy, I would say, of the willful ignorance to not think about it from other people's perspectives. I don't know how to not do that as a human being. I've always done that since I was a small child. So I don't know how people can stand there, sit there, type there, no, there should, what I believe is what everybody else should do. But then never put themselves in the situation of, well, if this happened to me, if this happened to somebody I knew, I would assume their feelings would change on the situation for that one person, but they would still turn around and make it, nobody else should be allowed to do it. And that's something else that's gone around on the commentary is so abortion is being, limiting access is now illegal in certain states. People in power, wealthy people, are always going to have access to safe abortions. They might not be quote unquote legal, but they have enough money to cover it up, or they can send somebody somewhere that it is legal, all that good stuff. So there's a large impact on the lower middle class, the poverty stricken. So it's just unfair. Just like Dr. Kassie said with the mental gymnastics, I can't do that many flips to understand them. I can't. So, and yeah, that I was lucky. Because I think I would have gotten into, my rage would have really taken over. And I think I probably would have said some things that went too far in the moment, because I am also coming into learning how to feel my anger, and I haven't fully figured out how to temper it in a healthy way when it gets past a certain point. So in that aspect, I'm slightly glad my algorithms, my tendencies on social media was able to kind of shroud me from having to experience that in the moment.
Fair enough. Keshav, did you want to add anything? Oh, Cassie.
Sorry, I just wanted to add something to Andrea's before we moved on, unless Keshav has something that's directly related to that. I think one of the things that I'm struggling with currently is the people who show up on my social media are very much like me, but I also know that there are people who do not show up on my social media that they still can see whatever I post. And then if I like went looking for it, like I would definitely see it. And I feel like I end up in this like weird teeter-totter situation where like we all know that like social media is not going to change anybody's mind. But at the same time, I struggle because I think there's been points where people are like, well, if you like don't agree with me, then I'm just gonna unfriend you or unadd you or things like that. And I mean, there's definitely been times where like for my own mental health, I have cut strings with people, but I also am somebody who has always tried to make the world a better place. At least like as far as I see the world and being a better place. Obviously, there's people who disagree with my viewpoints, but I think I play this weird game where I'm like, well, do I add you and risk like the trolling and the like uneducated like commentary and things like that, or do I stick it out and I make these comments and leave you there? And because part of me is like, doesn't like people who I already know agree with me, like they're just going to agree with me. It's just not going to do anything. And sometimes I wonder if I leave everybody on my Facebook and on my social media in general, unless there's a reason for like safety or something to like not. Because I think one of the things that is very fascinating to me, and I've always been somebody who's very interested in having political conversations and things like this. I think this has been really politicized, and really shouldn't be. But that's a whole other level. And I think that that's one of the things that when we get frustrated with other people, I think one of the things is that sometime, and not all the time and not for everybody, but hopefully at some point we will say something inadvertently that just clicks. Like there have been times where I've had those conversations and I'm very much I'm about like, I don't have a lot of conversations about like military things because it's not my area. But I've had lots of really good conversations with people who have very different views. And I think that's one of those things where we need to remember that like people can be frustrating, especially if they don't see things the way that we do. But there's also there's a little bit of civic action in trying to have those conversations anyway. And that just what you were talking about, Andrea, just made me think of that. So I just want to add that before we move on, but I will get.
Yeah, I think I don't know, the thought that kind of went off in my head when Andrew was speaking was like, we all are obviously of like minds when it comes to political, beliefs and, Roe v. Wade and things like that. But, the opposite is also true where like the more conservative side also has their same echo chamber where, they get to just keep going down that road and just maybe even more staunchly on their side. And I'm very much a person who like looks at Twitter and Facebook and likes things and retweets things, but I don't feel like I personally like have the right words to say to tweet, and that's just me personally. But I will see all of these comments and I don't feel as I don't know, as eloquent or as like capable to not just change someone's mind, but just say anything of value that isn't just me screaming onto my keyboard type of a thing. So like my reaction a lot of the times is just to like read it just so I am aware of what their thoughts are and to make sure that I am not fully stuck in my own echo chamber, because it's very easy to get into that mindset. But I feel like a lot of the discourse that's going on the other sides, or at least in the very small slice of people in my, mutual friends or whatever on Facebook and Twitter and all, are very much just kind of saying like, oh, this is a good thing, but not actually saying why, or like, oh, this is, part of my religious beliefs, but not actually like understanding what that means. And like another point that I very much agreed with, I think it was Cassie who said it, was this country has never really been about religious freedom. I was born Hindu, so a lot, and I am in a very Christian city, especially growing up. And, it was, I got a lot of kind of naive questions about it. Obviously, when I was a kid, but then also when I was 18 and 22 and 25, like the same questions by the same people just kept coming up, and, getting different religions mixed up, not understanding what freedom is or why something happens. And I feel like all of these wires start to get so crossed in people's minds that they start to argue things that they're not, that aren't actually part of the point, if that makes sense. And I feel like I'm not sure how to like change that, like there's obviously something that we can do to make the change, but what that is kind of beyond me, other than just having the conversations for me in person and like trying to understand what the other person's point of view is. And like, for me, like personally, I am never going to get an abortion. I am a, straight man who, has all of the biological things that I was kind of born with. But my wife, on the other hand, is she has a bleeding disorder called von Willebrand's, and that causes a lot of like just excess bleeding. And my, low key, not low key worry is that, something happens, she gets pregnant, and, I think that if that happens, there's a large chance that she will not make it through the pregnancy. So my first thought is, if anything goes wrong, like me and her need to sit down and seriously talk about getting that abortion. And now I feel like, there's such a fear around that idea now. It's very disheartening to see, not just for me, but for all of the people in my life, whether they're a man or a woman, just watching this happen and seeing especially women around me just become so afraid of living in this country and just living, period,
So I do have two questions that came off of Cassie's first point, because as you were just talking about, like the opposing side, which these would be questions that they would ask. So Cassie, you said something about like not worrying, like other people worrying about what people are doing with their bodies. Obviously, these past 2 years, that debate has been heavy in a different subject in regards to the mask mandates. That was the primary thing that a lot of people said, like, why should I be forced to wear a mask if it's my body? And literally the quotes were, my body, my choice. So, and then now we're fast forwarding, and some of those same people have the same things about abortion, like my body, my choice. But some of them have flipped, is like, oh, this is a good thing. So it's like flippity flop flop. So when you hear people saying that now, like comparing it to the COVID mask thing, what do you guys think? And this is just open for anyone to hop in.
I think that I probably at least mildly can speak for the majority of us, if not all of us. My body, my choice have two very different meanings in these situations and across many other situations. What happens inside of my uterus has no bearing on somebody else. And I know that there are many people that can argue that many different ways and all of that. And I think at least we've all at least came into contact with one of the people that seemed like, oh, well, my body, my choice, like when it's abortion, but not when it's mask. The difference between the mask mandate and this conversation about reproductive rights is that my uterus, that a trans man's uterus, another woman's uterus, a non-binary person's uterus, they don't affect anybody. A mask and not wearing it, which is the reason that it has taken us so long to get out of COVID, if we can even say that. Like the reality is I don't think we're ever going to be out of COVID. There are differences, and we miss a lot of very like particular words. Words matter. And I think it's really important that people recognize that words matter and meanings matter and things like that. They matter. The reality is that, again, like it comes down to mental gymnastics. And, I think that's one of the things that throws me for a loop is that, and I think it gets a lot of us into trouble, is often the people who question things and wonder if they have a place to say something are the people who should be saying something. And the people who are adamant about knowing everything probably should be. And I mean, that comes directly from like a really good counseling professor that I had. Being unsure about things means that you're thinking about them. Being sure about them means that you're probably not looking at all sides of the aspect. But yeah, I think that my biggest issue is that, again, like my body, my choice means a lot of different things in a lot of different situations. And I mean, I'm just going to keep echoing it. Like, I don't understand why what anybody does with their body affects you. But when it comes to who you love, what you do with your uterus, what you do with your hand, like as long as you're not laying hands on other people, like have at it, I guess. But like, just don't harm people, like verbally, emotionally, psychologically, physically, like stay in your lane. So I mean, that's my thought on my body, my choice. I'm sure that other people probably have much more eloquent ways of saying that, but I think I'm just at the point where like everything is kind of frustrating.
Anyone else want to add or talk about like with the COVID and the mask, my body, my choice, and then people comparing it to this? Anyone else want to add anything?
I mean, I feel like Kassie hit the nail on the head. Words have meaning. Words are powerful. It's the nuance of the context is totally different. Like somebody's internal reproductive organs or external versus putting a physical mask that is removable from your face. If you really don't want a mask, you don't have to go outside. The nuance of the situation is completely different. And it really bothers me when people say it like that. It's like, oh, my body, my choice. It's the same thing. But then, of course, when the abortion rights come out, they flip sides. So it's only convenient for them. And the other thing about, the nuance of my body, my choice for the mask mandates, you not wearing a mask potentially can get somebody ill to the point of death. Me being pregnant or choosing not to be pregnant does not harm another living person. The argument about, when is a fetus alive and all that good stuff does come into play, but that is still an internal inside of my own body. What I choose to do with that is not going to make somebody else with a separate body standing on their own feet, or that might be an ableist phrase, I'm sorry, in their own existence, if they're not affected by my choice to do something within my own body, versus if I choose not to wear a mask, I cough, somebody's immunocompromised, elderly, just doesn't have a great immune system or has comorbidities, they get sick from COVID and die. It just doesn't equate. It does not equate. It is not the same thing.
Right. And I imagine those groups also that you're describing are also going to be disproportionately affected by limited, access Kind of like Keshav was saying regarding your wife, when we talk about masks, when we talk about abortion, when we talk about reproductive access, right? There is a common group that's being affected. So they're perhaps not so different, right? Because, disabled folks are really going to get, slammed by both things coming up. And then, of course, you can go ahead, make that, multiply it when those disabled folks are also Black, brown, queer, limited access to healthcare, all of that.
Wanted to add something?
Yeah. Similarly to what Andrea and Cassie were saying, that words matter, and the my body, my choice is completely different when you apply it to different situations. During COVID, even though we're still in COVID, but during the peak 2 years, I worked for a nonprofit public entity where we would see 20 to 30,000 people come in on a daily basis. And the whole time I was expected to work and not approach these people to follow COVID guidelines. But then it would be the whole my body, my choice smack in the face of, it's not just your body, you're affecting me, you're affecting my friends and family, you're affecting so many other people in the community around you. So your point is moot. And having to balance that, I know I would talk to Martin and Courtney about it all the time, just because there would be nights where I was so upset that somebody was in my face potentially harming me over a mask that could protect everyone around them. And it was just mind-blowing that they could use that argument, and it's never sat well with me. It will never sit well with me. And it's crazy to think that there are people who will use that phrase and just twist it however they want to. And it's not a supporting argument. You will listen to people say, oh, it's my body, my choice. But then when you bring up but it affects 2 other people or 4 other people or X amount of people, and then they just sit there dumbfounded because they didn't actually take the time to think about what they're saying or what their belief systems are, because they are so channeled into thinking one way that they don't actually pause and sit back and reflect and say, oh, maybe this doesn't actually work, or maybe I should actually think about what I believe in. So yeah, it's just incredibly frustrating.
I would, since I've been dropping the lighter note things every time it gets a little hot and heavy around here. I will say, for the mask thing, the people who made the mask should have made them more glasses friendly, because if you're going to make me wear a mask all the time, which is fine, just, the fog in the glasses was tough. Just saying, from a lighter note, but it was all necessary to
that part super sucked.
Oh, it was terrible. So bad.
Yeah.
It really did. And then over the winter time in Ohio, it was so bad. It was so bad. We needed windshield wipers.
It was terrible on a lighter note. Anyone else?
Back to dark side for a second.
Oh.
Sorry, Martin. I know.
Okay.
I think the thing that is also frustrating is the fact that in both of these situations, there's science. Science exists. Science is something that we have conversations about and then we just ignore. I mean, there are times where I'm I don't know why I went to school for 5,000 years to be really specialized in this one thing. And I mean, to be fair, mine's not the most applicable in the world, but most people will say that pro-choice people are saying let me make my decision with my doctor. The masks were said the people who do the research said wear masks. It'll mitigate it. It's also the fact that we just ignore it. We just ignore these things that we are hey, go out and take the GRE, take the med entrance or the medical school entrance exams, take a medical licensing exam. But as soon as you tell me to put something on my face, nah, I'm good. It just doesn't it doesn't make sense. And I think that's where I get really stuck a lot of the times is we just we have this lovely thing of science, and then when we don't agree with the science, we go, whoop, bye science. See you when you're convenient. Because I don't think any of us love wearing masks. I wore masks because my grandfather was literally diagnosed with cancer a week after COVID hit hard. And I didn't see anybody the entire time that I was at home where my parents were taking care of my grandfather. My mom and my brother both work in healthcare. And like everybody like showered and stripped down before like entering the house to make sure that we like made sure like wearing a mask is such a like low hanging thing. And like I think a lot of people who were afforded like either getting minimally like sick because they just happened to like get the lesser strand, I guess. It's again, like I get so stuck on the fact that like we have solid facts to back up the things that we keep saying are like liberal snowflake things. And it's not like we don't want to like, I don't want to wear a mask any more than any of you do. I don't wear my glasses because I don't want them to fog up, which is probably not great. But I mean, I have that ability because I don't need them to actually like see all that well. But it's the blatant disregard for like the hard sciences that we make everybody jump through lots and lots of student debt and lots of gray hair because most medical providers have gray hair by the time they get through medical school because it's stressful. Why do we have science if we're not going to listen to it? I think is my thing. And I mean, the same thing's true of abortion. Like, and I assume that at some point we'll have this conversation, but like there was a 10-year-old girl in Ohio that had to cross state line to get an abortion because if I remember correctly, she was raped by a family member. And she was 3 days outside of that 6-week heartbeat bill, which is also based on your last period, which is crap because that's not when you get pregnant. But again, we're ignoring science. We're just putting political things in place. And there is a 10-year-old girl that got told to, if my sources are correct, to see it as an opportunity. An opportunity for what? An opportunity to literally like never be able to have children because at 10, I don't know about the rest of you, but my body couldn't have sustained that. There are grown women who can't sustain pregnancy. Don't tell them it's an opportunity. It's literally not. It's the end of a lot of opportunities that maybe the kid that got raped at 10 could have cured cancer because that seems to be the popular argument for like not having abortions. And I recognize I sound very angry, but I work with children day in and day out. And a lot of my kids are at a much higher risk for being taken advantage of. And I'm more angry about Roe versus Wade because of the other people that it will affect. Because if I'm going to be perfectly honest, it's not going to affect me a whole lot. I'm angry and I am upset and I'm frustrated because the people that I dedicate my entire life to helping have a better chance at life are going to be the ones that suffer. And there is nothing more frustrating in my life than seeing my friends hurt who their rights are already being threatened. And if nothing else, I think that one of the biggest things to say at this point is that if you don't think that we're in trouble right now, you're very, very, very sorely mistaken. And I think that one of the things that Danielle had mentioned earlier is that this wasn't her tipping point. And that is a solid reflection of the fact that really crappy situations have been going on in this country for a lot longer. And it's really important for us and everybody else to recognize that, and that this isn't the first thing that's going wrong. This is an avalanche that has finally started to get the attention of other people. And the reality of this is that most awful historical things didn't happen in a day. And it's the ignoring every little thing along the way that's going to get us in trouble. So if you feel, because this is the first time in my life that I've ever felt like half the stuff that comes out of my mouth sounds like a conspiracy theory. At this point, the conspiracy theories sound like they're fact. And 10 years ago, I would have been like, oh my God, like, what is wrong with you? But now I'm like, there are people on TikTok telling you not to buy pregnancy tests with your credit card, not to look like you when you go in to buy a pregnancy test, to delete the apps that help you figure out if you can become pregnant. It's not about people choosing to have children. It's not about people choosing to have sex. That shouldn't be a question. People can do with their body what they want. And I apologize because we're on a soapbox. But the other portion of this is that this isn't the beginning. This isn't the end. This is the point where we really need to be aware of the fact that like something needs to be done. And I know that a lot of people are disheartened by a lot of Democratic politicians, and I am too, because like 15 minutes after Roe versus Wade was overturned, we got emails about giving money. I hope at some point we have these like radical Democrats that everybody seems to be terrified of, because the ones that we got right now aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing. And honestly, I think that taking heed of things that sound mildly like conspiracy theories might actually be a good way to keep yourself safe these days. So obviously I just went on a rant and I did not mean to, but I'm just angry. Like, do not tell a 10-year-old that their rapist gave them an offer. That is not acceptable. It will literally rip that child apart. Thank God for once in a very long time, Indiana happened to be the more progressive state and could provide that. But it's a reality. Like, there are people, they're bad. I don't want to say bad people, but there have been people that have heard other like men say, oh, well, now I get to like kick the mother of my child. Do you have any idea how much that causes people's skin to crawl? Definitely took that a much darker route than I had originally intended to, but I'm beside myself. I am so sorry that it took us getting to this point for white women to figure this out fully, or not even fully, but at least recognize that like, this is what it feels like. Things that I think a lot of us have that on. But I mean, the reality is like, once it happens to you, it puts it into a different perspective. And I wish that that's not what it took. But we need to do better.
So your rant actually worked perfectly, because it actually did connect to the second question I was going to ask off of the first thing that you said in backtracking, because you brought up the Democratic Party and the political thing, because I was going to say the thing that this and the mask thing did have in common, they were both political tools by both parties. So you brought up the Democratic Party and how they need to do better and all of that jazz. I think my biggest problem with that statement is that it shouldn't be a Democratic Party issue. This should be a United States of America issue. And I know we talked about this last week, and I know I just talked to Andrea about this yesterday night, about we got to get to a point where when we were all little, we were taught that the people at DC represented the best of us. Like, they were the smartest, they were the brightest, like they were the top of the top. Like, if something happened to America, those people would be the ones to save it. And obviously, as we got older, not so much. And I'm not just coming at the Democratic Party either. I'm coming at both parties that this human rights shouldn't be a political tool. It should be a United States of America and whole issue that we should be trying to maintain people's human rights. And when you brought up the Democratic Party, also, obviously, the president right now is a Democrat, Joe Biden. If anyone did see yesterday, he was talking about signing an executive order to protect women's reproductive rights, which is a good thought, but then could also open another Pandora's box because he ain't going to be president forever. You don't know who's going to be president until they're locked in. So if he does that, next president could just come in, take that out, and write stricter abortion things. So that's a whole other slippery slope, but neither here nor there. But when Biden was reading his teleprompter thing, he read and I think the last line was talking about how women vote more than men or something of that nature. Then the last line was repeat this line 3 times for emphasis. If you haven't seen it, it's on the internet. It's bad. But that's just one of those things where you think he's doing the right thing, but then when he is an older dude, reading that last part of the teleprompter, you're just it's a political ploy, because obviously I think he wants to rerun, which he'd be 9 billion years old when he reruns. But we're at that point too where it shouldn't. I just don't like these type of things being political issues. They should just be people should not be political issues. We should be trying to help people. And obviously now both parties will use this going forward, because we're in the middle of 2022, which I don't know about y'all, but it kind of feels like it's flowing by. By New Year's next year in 2023, we will start seeing the campaign commercials for people in primaries, both Republican, Democrat, all of that. And the abortion stuff will be oh, I tried to fight for your rights, so you should vote for me, or I fought for the rights for people to live, you should vote for me. And talking about the people you talked about, Cassie, those people don't want their issues being the main the political thing of oh, I have to vote for this person, because if I don't vote for this person, my life is in jeopardy. That I can't speak for Washington and all the forefathers, but I don't think that's what they intended. And that's where we're at right now, because Andrea, you brought up something about wanting to do something. And Chelsea, you brought up about when President Trump got elected. I was telling Andrea last night, when Ruth died, it was over. This was over. As soon as she died, that's when the true window opened, because Clarence was appointed by Bush, which is when all of us were literally in elementary school. But Lord be knowing, President Trump got to put 3 people in. That is a lot. 3 out of 9, so a third, if my math is right. So he got to put Kavanaugh, he got to put Amy in, and then there was one other person who I'm forgetting their name, and I apologize. But I think Danielle also brought it up too that, and Cassie disappeared. But I think Danielle brought it up too that when you're voting for president and all that stuff, that's probably their biggest power, that they can put a Supreme Court person in there. So I just want to ask you all about the political side of this jazz, why I go and try and see what happened to Cassie upstairs. So anyone just take it away. Chelsea, you're in charge.
Oh, good. I'm Steve Harrington now. I'm the babysitter. And I'm stealing his seat. So politically, I know for me, we did touch upon when Trump was being elected, how there were people saying that, oh, you're going to be overreacting. But here we are. And I will die on this hill, but people need to vote in the primaries I studied poli-sci. I liked more of the theory than the actual current events, but people need to vote in the primaries, and we need to make voting accessible. There are so many times where absentee ballots get missed, or people don't have the means to check the registration or to actually have those tools to vote. But then you also have to look at our criminal justice system. I'm sure Andrea can talk about this a lot. But there are people who are in prison with marijuana charges, and now their vote is stripped away over something so simple as that. And we need to start looking into that and looking into our system more.
Jumping off of that point, I mean, that's everything. Is there are people with, nonviolent offenses, drug offenses, where in some states now that drug is legal, but it's still on their record and it prevents them from continuing to vote. There's also, I don't know the details, but there's been a lot of arguments about whether or not certain laws that are being passed or guidelines being passed are restricting the vote to people of color, lower income people. And like I said, I do work for a public housing authority, and I'm hoping, of course, no political agenda can be attached, but I'm hoping to be able to bring people into the property to educate the population on that property about being able to check they're registered to vote, where they would need to go to register to vote. If they need a state ID or driver's license because they don't currently have one to be able to vote, what are the steps to getting all that together? So that way we can have more people voting. Again, can't politicize any sort of events on property. You can't, per my job, obviously, no political opinions, but like, that's something that I thought about literally yesterday. I was like, because it is part of my job to host events on property, and we do have a governor's race this year. And so that would need to happen. Registration, I think, closes usually the beginning of October. So I'm hoping to be able to get permission and be allowed to do that for the beginning of September. So there's time for these residents that are interested or can at least get this information to have the choice to go ahead and go out there and do it. And so it would also be part of my job if they are, having issues with transportation, that the local voting site was moved several miles across town because San Antonio is huge, would be helping them, arrange transportation if that's what they want. So yeah, I think I got on a mini soapbox there, but there's so many people that are no longer able to vote because of, I will go ahead and say, minor nonviolent offenses. And it's not fair. I think the grand scheme of everything of this podcast is it's not fair. Like, everything is not equal. It's not equitable. It's just everything does intersect. And that's part of the compounding struggles, stresses, limiting of access, resources, all of that good stuff that Roe v. Wade touches on, but that gets into all these other different areas of life. So yeah, I think I need to stop now.
Fair enough. It sounded like it was great. So I did hear that Dr. Hernandez needs to leave soon. So I do, before you leave though, I want to make sure you get your final word in.
I guess my final word, just given the topic, would be to encourage anybody who's listening to take some time today, if you haven't already, to look up what your local voter hotline is or election hotline is. Save that in your phone. Use that when you need to. And it doesn't even just have to be on voting day. If you see something on your ballot that you think is not accessible for somebody else, and maybe even it doesn't immediately impact you, you can be the one to make that phone call. It really does make a difference. So ready yourselves with those phone numbers.
Anything else you'd like to say before you leave? That was great, though. That was great.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to chat. And I guess, I'm always going to push for expanding the horizon of this issue, make sure that you're always including queer and trans folks in the conversations, make sure you're including Black and brown folks in the conversations, and thinking about the people who aren't in the room, even if you are in a pretty homogenous group.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Thank you. So came in, it sounded like it was really great. So that part I'll have to listen to myself on the podcast. But just so we don't, since we are going to be pushing for time, last couple questions, which was about Planned Parenthood. That was one thing. I think there's a misconception that people think Planned Parenthood is a baby killing factory. So I would just want people to touch light on what actually is Planned Parenthood and what they actually do over there on all the services that they give, which now are in jeopardy.
I was just going to say, like, Planned Parenthood is so much more than abortions. It's sexual health care. So you can get STI and STD checked. You can go there for your regular, like, pap smears and things like that. But it's not just for the average person. A lot of what they do does go back towards the, like, lower classes and those who may not have the financial means or the healthcare means to actually have access to that portion of their healthcare. And it's such a great resource for the community that it's not even a shame. It's just insane to think that that's all people associate Planned Parenthood with is abortions. And there has been so many incidents where people are on their way to that clinic and they are harassed and mistreated for getting health care. Like, at the end of the day, it's healthcare. No matter which way you look at it, it is healthcare. And so on their way to visit their doctor, and it's, to Cassie's point, it's science. They are doctors. They are learned individuals who have spent their lives studying this and are there to provide that healthcare to these people. They are threatened. They are abused. They are religiously persecuted, and it's insane. And then there's also the extreme where there's these fake centers that exist maybe right down the road or wherever they may be. And these people will come up to you and try to act like they're going to help you get there, and then take you to this other center and just hold you hostage and abuse you and misuse science and just traumatize a person even more for going to their health provider. It's insane.
Anyone else want to add anything to that?
I think Chelsea, again, I say hit the nail on the head a little too many times this podcast, but the only other thing that I could think of was, I mean, Martin, where we used to work was right down the street from, I don't know if it was a Planned Parenthood or another sort of like women's health. Okay, Planned Parenthood. The amount of times I would drive past there, we had to use our own vehicles. The amount of times I would pass by there and there was a protest going on, and, you know, the graphic photos on posters and things like that. And this goes into the whole like anger, rage thing. I wanted to yell at them. I wanted to go up and like confront them, but I'm wearing my little, you know, work badge. I'm on my work time. And it's like, but the other thing is a lot of people, and I think the LGBTQ plus community in particular have kind of voiced a sense of comfortability with going to Planned Parenthood because they are more open and more willing to learn. And so a lot of LGBTQ plus people do go there for, particularly from what I understand, is like cancer screenings. A lot of people do go there for cancer screenings in addition to like sexual health checks, the pap smears, STI, STD testing, and being able to have access to somebody willing to write a birth control prescription for somebody who is like non-binary or transgender. Whereas other medical professionals, I will speak in Texas particularly, do impose those sorts of beliefs of like, well, I don't agree with how you're living your life. We're going to inadvertently shame you for coming in here. We're going to misgender you. We're not going to use the name you've chosen if your birth certificate hasn't been updated, all of that good stuff. So I do think there is a level of safety that Planned Parenthood provides for certain populations that could be stripped away and is like a safe haven that a lot of people go to. I myself have been to Planned Parenthood since it was just easier for me to do that when I lived in Ohio and was away from my primary care physician. So it's the double-edged sword of brand recognition. And I feel like that's part of why Planned Parenthood is attacked as being, the baby killers. So because it has brand recognition, it is popular and is a safe haven, but also because it has that brand recognition, it's targeted.
Anyone else want to add anything? No? Okay. So next couple of questions are, which I will say they are, I don't want to say bad questions, but misconceptions in regards to abortions and whatnot. Kassie, you've already touched on one of them with the 10-year-old, and Andrea and Chelsea shared this to me a long time ago when it was a female congressperson or whatever who said that if someone got raped, that is an opportunity to be a good mom, and you are robbing them the opportunity to be a good mom if an abortion was necessary in those situations. When you hear that, I know Cassie's already said what she said in regards to 10-year-old, but for everyone else, when you hear that, what do you want to say back?
I think my immediate reaction is to first look at the mother or whoever is is carrying that, the fetus, and ask them, do you want this child, or do you want this to occur? And then the second question is, okay, well, and then to the other side of it is looking at everybody in the foster care system. My Google search tells me that 420,000 kids are in foster care. Why are we not taking care of them before we're looking at this abortion issue? Why are we not first taking care of the people who are in society and alive and here, rather than worrying about why does the Supreme Court feel the need to do that? And why do people feel the need to kind of fight to take rights away, to give rights to the fetus until they are born, and then they get nothing? And then they get foster care, which, Kassie and I can attest to, where I can attest, and Kassie, I'm sure you can too, working with some of these kids is they're not in the best situations. And a lot of them are bright. And even if they're not, they should get those opportunities. And it just enrages me to know, and just to watch people say, oh, we should care about life and we should pro-life and all of this, and then turn around and not care about anybody who doesn't make above, a certain amount of money, not care about anybody in foster care, not care for anybody in, on food stamps or anything like that, not care about any LGBTQ plus people, to simultaneously say you're pro-life and then not care about most life, at least in America, let alone in the world, is just, to use Cassie's term, mental gymnastics to a degree that I can't comprehend. And, though that I think is one of many things that are being willfully ignored by the the opposing side, if that makes sense, or by the pro-life side, and by people who want or who are celebrating this, is just ignoring everything that occurs afterwards, right? If we're going to do the abortion, if we're going to reverse Roe v. Wade completely, then at least give all of the things that should go along with that, right? Give the mother the choice, or the family, whoever, the choice to give that child up to adoption, make that complete change and everything, but that's not going to happen. And that is, I think, also a failing around the conversation, and the kind of the incorrect terms of pro-choice and pro-life. Like, we're still giving the choice to someone, so it's still pro-choice. We're still giving life to someone, so it's still pro-life. Like I was saying earlier, like, I consider myself pro-life because if my wife if my wife gets pregnant, she has a high chance of dying. So I am pro-life just with my wife. Like, you know what I mean? There are so many scenarios that people not just ignore, but they're not aware of. And I mean, I wasn't aware of all of the bleeding things that could happen, not bleeding, things, but like things that could happen along with pregnancy, like bleeding disorders, like different sorts of higher risk things that happen during pregnancy, until I met my wife, and she kind of told me about von Willebrand and all the different bleeding disorders, and I was more educated on that. And I was like, well, this is a complete population of people that we're ignoring when we talk about this, like, along with all of the other populations, but also this one, and, I don't know, I'm getting on my own soapbox now. So
no, the soapbox is good, because I guess these soapboxes are just doing so great in connecting with things. But I do want to say what you just said, which was fantastic, about the pro-life, pro-choice, because it goes back to my thing about things being politicized. Because anytime you hear that, you instantly think like, oh, you're pro-life, that means you're against abortions and all of that. If you're pro-choice, you're against abortions. And those got hijacked. I don't know if it was 50 years ago when Roe v. Wade happened, or before that. But I know, me personally, like you just said, like I would consider myself both, because like I don't want people just going out there killing people. So obviously I care about people's lives and all of that situation. And if a baby is born and all of that, I want them to have like the better healthcare services, like foster care, all that jazz. So in that situation, you're pro-life in something. And then like the choice, it's like, I think everyone is pro-choice, that everyone wants to have their own choice to choose, not necessarily in regards to just this, but in everything. So I feel like when you take the politics out of the side, everyone is a little bit of both. But when you throw in abortion, then you make it about politics. You're just like, oh, well, I have to go with this way because I feel this way, or vice versa. Because if you don't want to get an abortion, that is fine. That is your choice. Like, that's the whole crux of this all. Like, that is your choice. And if you do decide to have your child, hopefully, if you're in a situation where the government can help in any way that it can, because they want to protect the lives of all the Americans, which means the ones, like you just said, who are in those foster care systems. So I think everyone is both, but when you throw in like abortion and the politics, that's when you split it up. So.
I mean, I think the really big point here is that, and I don't know if any of you have watched the like Roe v. Wade Netflix documentary, but the reality is that everybody's technically pro-life, but it is whose life we're talking about. So there's actually some people have started calling it like pro-choice and anti-choice, which obviously, like, no matter how you spin this, there's going to be some sort of like negative connotation. The reality is that this isn't like, I think that we talk about it along party lines a lot because that's what we're used to. The reality is that it's not. Like, pro-choice and pro-life have never been just along party lines. I think that right now there are a lot of there's a lot of kind of like leaning on the Republican side because that's who appointed the Supreme Justices. But the other portion of this is that it's also being shown that like the ruling with the Supreme Court is not what the people like support. And I think that's another issue. And I mean, like, we could go all day long about how like we're reaching this crux in history, which unfortunately for a lot of us, we've lived through a ton of history that we would probably prefer to live through. Is that on average, democratic governments only last like 250 years. And we're at about, I think, like 240 to like 246, 248 at this point. And this is going to sound so like silly and lighthearted, but it's like we're in like season like 7 of Lost and they're just throwing shit in to see what happens. But the problem is that these are real people's lives. Like, these are real things. And I mean, to Keshav's point, like, I'm going to carry a torch until the day I die for kids. Because the reality is kids are their tomorrow, and they deserve to have a good tomorrow. But the other thing is like, we want people to have kids, but then we don't want to give maternity leave that's paid. We don't want to give paternal or paternity leave that's paid. We don't want to house and feed these people. We just want them to have a baby. But what do you do with that baby afterwards? Like, most kids, I mean, not to be fair, I'm not going to like say most kids in the foster care system, but a lot of kids in the foster care system come out with trauma, a lot of it. And it is due to the fact that there's a shortage in people who are going to do foster homes. There is a shortage in the amount of resources that get sent to those foster homes. There's a shortage of people who can mentally sustain long enough to stay in like DCS, Department of Children's Services, any sort of like, they're supposed to be protecting these, and they're doing their best. But the reality is we have a broken system. The system is broken. And I don't know if Roe versus Wade being overturned does not highlight that for you. I don't know what's going to. And I think that's the biggest piece here is like, well, we say that we have these solutions. Well, if you're pro-life, why don't you go be a foster parent? If you're pro-life, why don't you go adopt the babies and the kids that are already out there? I mean, there are a lot of like, yeah, babies, everybody's going to adopt a baby. But the reality is there's a lot of people who go ahead and have kids and then they find out that they can't do it, or something happens where they don't get to keep their kid. And that kid doesn't get the same opportunities as everybody else. Give the 5-year-old, the 15-year-old, the 6-year-old a shot. You don't need other people to have babies that they're not prepared to take care of to be pro-life. And again, I mean, like, that's the thing. Like, nobody's out here being like, hey, like, you know what? I want to like encourage abortions. People just know their limits. And people know the limits of the government. Like, the pro-life piece, like, and I was very open about my support for Pete Buttigieg last round. I'm fine with Biden, but again, I think there's been a little bit of an issue in terms of like being able to do as much, which we ultimately get kind of stonewalled anyway. But like, the only person I've seen that is not a woman that explains like abortions, like, we talk about these late term abortions and it's bullshit. Like, you're having a late term abortion, you were prepared to have that baby. You wanted that kid. And it is heartbreaking to walk into a doctor's appointment and be told that your kid can't live, or that you're going to die if your kid is born. And that is a choice that I hope to God I never have to make. But the reality is the late term abortions, anything that is a miscarriage, which 1 in 4 women have, anything that is a late term abortion is because that child couldn't sustain life, or it was going to kill the mother. Like, it's not a flippant like conversation that we have. Nobody's ripping babies out of people's uteruses. Nobody's doing that. Like, that's not what's happening. And it's really important to take that perspective, because there are a lot of people that go through a lot of counseling and a lot of mental health help afterwards, because they had a crib, they had a name, they had toys, they had baby showers. There was supposed to be a baby. There was supposed to be a kid that grew up and became 70 years old, became a scientist, became a police officer, became a rocket scientist. I don't know, like any number of things. Maybe they could have cured cancer, but sometimes biology doesn't work so great. So, I mean, I think that's one of the things that I think is important for people, like, as you're thinking about these things, like, take a second and try to step back and see it from somebody else's point of view.
To jump in on that too, with pro-life and wanting babies and wanting to have that opportunity, it's also for the people who are struggling to get pregnant with IVF and going through fertility treatments and all of those other heartbreaking and heart-wrenching and physically exhausting medical procedures. Like, there are people who are actively trying to become pregnant that Roe v. Wade is going to affect with IVF. And that should concern people fundamentally. So just to jump in on that too.
I also want to say too, with not just from the political thing too, but also from the big business side, that Kassie, you brought up like healthcare and all that jazz. I do find it funny how a lot of the big companies who get complained about their workers' healthcare and all that stuff were the first people to say, hey, we will pay for you to get, if you need to fly somewhere to get an abortion. So now that is also in the benefits package that companies are going to use to recruit people, like, which is crazy to say out loud. It's like, oh, if you need an abortion, whatever, you can go work for Google, because they'll go fly you to wherever you want, but still won't give you good health insurance. So it's all become more of a tool now than a human rights issue, which I think is the true main issue that we're talking about on this podcast. And I do want to say, since we are close to the 2-hour mark, I do want to go into everyone's closing thoughts that they want to say. And it doesn't matter which order it is. It's just Kassie gets the last word. You want to go first?
I could go first,
Go
I guess. At the end of the day, this is a much deeper issue that is affecting our country. It's not just about choice versus life. It's healthcare, but then it's also our whole social structure. When people think Democrat versus Republican, you look at, well, this is more of a fiscal issue or this is more of a social issue, but it's so much deeper than that. And I think people need to take the time to educate themselves and not just step back and say, oh, well, this is what we voted for. This is what we did. Like, you have to educate yourself and be aware of your privilege and be aware that this is not just affecting one part of our population. Thanks.
Andrea?
I unfortunately have gone blank. Kassie, your examples about the third the late term abortions always being kind of harped on, and I'm not sure exactly why that. I mean, I just started crying. I think y'all noticed me wipe tears. So like, I am just kind of sitting here existing. I don't really have much for closing thoughts. I feel like I've said a lot more than I intended to during this podcast. I feel very strongly on this subject, and I know Martin knows why. And it's, I think we all could stand to, once we figure out, we as a collective society, figure out what our plan of action should be to try to get these rights back, following through with them. I know I've seen a lot of, and I will say, radical ideas. I think the day the news broke, I saw stuff on Twitter or Facebook, or not Facebook, Instagram, talking about like well, if women all just, collectively across the entire country, every single woman or the majority of women just sat out of work and said, we will not go back to work until, either a law amendment, something was put in place to protect our ability to have comprehensive reproductive health care, then, everything would switch up because we are a capitalist society. So like if money is not being made, if people are hemorrhaging money, shit's going to change. But the likelihood of that actually happening, even though we were all, I can't say all, a lot of people were very upset. I mean, you have to be in a financially privileged place to be able to be like, nah, I'm going to sit here and not work. You could lose your job. Potentially, police get called, you could get arrested, and that's on your record. That's your potential to get a job later on. Like, I think once there is some sort of viable plan, just being able to collectively figure out ways to execute it. Because I know I said earlier, like, I do feel fairly helpless that I want these things. I want these rights back. And honestly, to beyond Roe v. Wade, like Danielle was saying earlier, I mean, the rights that were being stripped away from the trans community, we need all of that back. We unfortunately as a society were never at a point where all of our human rights were there. We have never been a fully equal society among all the different groups, all the intersectionalities. And I just, once there's a plan, I just hope we can all push forward and push through, I guess is all I can really come up with at the moment. But I really enjoyed getting to, hear everybody's opinions and meet a couple new people. But yeah, thank you, Kassie, Martin, for kind of putting this together for us.
Just a moderator. Kassie did everything.
I don't think that's true.
I think it's true, but that's okay. Keshav, do you have anything you want to say?
I think we're also going off on so many different points that we're forgetting that this is just taking away rights from women. Like we used to talk, like but like in the 50s, it was about rights for African Americans. And like before that, it was the right for, like just like that. We're now not just talking about we're talking about 50% of the population or more, honestly. And I think we need to keep in mind that this affects everyone, no matter what, man, woman, anything, any breathing person is something that this affects. So whether it's today or tomorrow, whether it's a friend or, a partner, a family member, this is something that is going to end up affecting so much more in an avalanche type of way, and we need to make sure that we keep fighting for all of these rights for everybody around us. Again, I'm a man who is unable to physically have a child. I don't need to be here, but for me, this is something that is utterly ridiculous that I have to be fighting for in this country. And in 2022, for me, that's the part that gets me, is we are fighting for basic human rights, basic things for all of us to have. Just the freedom to have control over my own body is something that I can say and someone else can't. And that to me is utterly insane. And we are in an age where a lot of things are being brought up, and a lot of issues against different communities, and a lot of things are being protested against. And I think we need to make sure that we keep fighting, and we keep making sure that we go on fighting for all of our rights, or else what is the difference between us and any other non-democratic nation in history? We're just going to have things happen to us, and we're going to think that we're in any sort of control. So we need to keep fighting. And we need to keep in mind that elections happen every 2 years, not every 4. And we can make the differences that we make need to happen every 2 years. And that's the pressure that we need to put on everybody in the House and the Congress and all of these, different, parts of government. This is how we change our country, and this is how we change the world. And again, I would like to thank you guys for having me on. It has been a pleasure to be able to talk through a lot of these issues that have just been going on in my head or just with, people around me. But it's nice to be able to hear all of these different perspectives and keep things in mind. So thank you for inviting me on to this.
From the happier standpoint, thank you everyone for listening to the L7C podcast. Definitely the longest episode that is not our end of year podcast when we have like everyone on. So new accomplishment there, new badge. By the time you do listen to this after it's edited by our producer and all that jazz, maybe there's some new laws that have been enacted. Maybe once we all read Biden's executive order, that helps, but only time will tell. The only thing I really have left that I want to add is the same thing I've said throughout the podcast, that human rights should not be a political or big business issue. So I think that goes without saying, but make sure you like, rate, comment, subscribe anywhere you listen to. And Cassie, take us home.
I think I'm really appreciative for having the people around me and the opportunity to actually like put thoughts and be able to process through this, because I think there's been a lot in the last couple of weeks since Roe versus Wade was overturned that like I've had a really hard time processing it, and I imagine that there are many, many more people who also have that struggle, and I just really want to take a step back, because I think it's really important to like recognize that I've been privileged enough to not necessarily be directly impacted until Roe versus Wade. And I think it's really important that all of us white women take a nice hard look at that, because I think that, yes, we're a slight minority because we're women versus men, but I think it's really important to also recognize that like this is a turning point where we start to recognize that like you actually know how it feels to be oppressed. And I encourage everybody who thinks about Roe versus Wade as we move forward to really think about how many things this actually impacts. The reality is that there are people who wanted children that are no longer going to try for children. And that is because they're terrified that if they get pregnant and something goes wrong with the pregnancy, that the mother will die. There are people who live in red states that cannot afford to cross state lines. That is in itself a privilege, especially for people who can barely make ends meet with 2 to 3 jobs, trying to just feed the kids that they have. The people that you're fighting for, women-wise, and trans women or trans men, anybody with a uterus, it impacts them. It impacts white men. It impacts Indian men. It impacts Black men. It impacts everybody. And I will tell you right now that people are listening. And if you're not vocal, silence is loud. I have so many thoughts. And I think one of the biggest thoughts is that our government is not doing what it's supposed to do right now. Our government is not protecting us. And I mean, I agree with Martin, like human rights should just be rights. Like they're not things we need to talk about. As you go through your life, I want you to take a second and recognize that when I say you're privileged, it does not mean that you did not struggle. It means that you did not struggle because of a specific thing. For instance, I do not struggle because of the color of my skin. Keshav does not struggle because he's a man. But I'm a woman and Keshav's Indian. And there are different things that come along with that. Like I said, I think that at some point we need to get back to the point where the government actually represents the common person. They don't right now. I mean, Kavanaugh is currently upset because he got harassed while he was eating a fancy dinner.
Oh, can I throw something in before you keep going? So these people who are giving the 6-3 vote and calling them the 6, can we not call them the 6? Because me personally, the only people who I call the 6 are the 6 original Avengers and the 6 original Power Rangers. So we need to figure out a different nickname for those people. Just saying. But carry on.
Satan spawn, it's fine.
No, I get that. But yeah, I mean, the reality is that there were 6 unelected people who made a vast change in our constitutional rights that based it upon the fact that technically Roe versus Wade wasn't old enough to be considered a staple part of the Constitution, which if we're going to go by that, theoretically we should go back about 250 years when you didn't have access to electric, running water. Well, maybe you have running water. I don't know. I'm not a historian. But the reality is that is a bullshit reason. And I mean, by those standards, there are a lot of things we should be doing. Anyway, I yet again jumped on top of my little soapbox and lived there, but I appreciate everybody who listens to this because I assume that you're looking for more information and to understand why people are upset. But I want you to be very, very aware of the fact that this is not the end of change. And that there are very real rights that are being threatened. One of the next cases that have been brought up as being something that people will vote on is returning how we count votes to the states. And that means that we are no longer a democracy. If that happens, that means that if you live in a red state, your state is always going to vote red. If you live in a blue state, it's always going to vote blue. That benefits literally none of us. So I hope people reflect on the fact that it's not just elections. We need more people that sound like us, look like us, and are made up like us to actually run for government. And we need to stop just electing whoever has the most money, because that's essentially what happens almost every time. And I had one very salient point that I can no longer remember, which is making me upset. But the reality of all of this is that we just want to live our lives. Everybody just wants to live their lives. And they just want to choose how to do that. And if you're not like causing harm to other people, like maybe just let people do that. So, I mean, again, we started this out as talking about abortion, but the reality is like we're watching. To sound like a conspiracy theorist, we're watching like the deterioration of our government and our country. We went so far forward and we're going so far back so fast. And it amazes me to this day that it takes us so long to fight for our rights, but they disappear in an instant. So I think that's just something that as we move forward in talking about elections and things like that, maybe we start pushing for people who change the way that our government looks. And I'm going to stop there because I went on another soapbox.
Soapbox City, it's fine.
It's all right. Well, with that,
sorry.
They're fine. With that being said, thank you everyone for listening to the L7C podcast. Signing out. Thank you for listening to this episode of the L7C podcast. Be sure to like, rate, review, and subscribe to the channel. Follow us on all social media platforms, and we'll be talking to you guys soon. Take care.